Hi, this is Joe Green, head pastor of St. Paul Missionary Baptist Church, located in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Also, the founder of the 2019 movement, and I want to share a couple of thoughts with you. Recently, the federal or Juneteenth, I should say, was made a federal holiday, signed into law by the president. And there's controversy on both sides. There's different points of view of Juneteenth, and some people are for it, and some people are against it. And I'm for it, and I'll explain why. And I think that Juneteenth shouldn't be something that only Black people should observe, but for all Americans, everyone who loves this country and all who claim that they stand for the principles of this country, the guiding principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all these other things that we say that we stand for. And I want to share why. If there's a time, and I was just a little bit of background about myself, a little bit of background about me is I was raised by the two primary men in my life. Was my pop, who grew up in the deep South in Georgia. He taught me all about racism and prejudice. He was born in 1912, so he saw firsthand Jim Crow and racial segregation and prejudice and all that other stuff. And then also my stepfather, who was formerly a Black Panther back in the 60s and 70s. And so he would give me a different perspective on looking at race relations. And so I was able to learn from both of them. And I think that and also to study history, but also to understand the Bible. And when you put all those components together, I think it's given me rather unique perspective and a balance. Hopefully it's a balanced perspective, and hopefully you'll find something beneficial from this talk. Also, I'd like to encourage you that if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please like and share any of the information that I share that you may think is beneficial. But I think these conversations are vitally important. And so let's talk a little bit about why it's important for all Americans, this federal holiday of Juneteenth. And again, this is not just Black people should be celebrating it. It should be celebrated by all Americans, all those who believe that this is a great country. And I'll just say, before I go any further, that I believe that America is the greatest country on this side of heaven. It's not perfect. The only perfect governmental system, the only perfect nation there is the kingdom of God, right? The kingdom of heaven. That's the only perfect one. But on this side of heaven, I believe the United States is the greatest nation on earth. And I stand with that. I've served my country, went in the United States Navy, and and I don't hate this country. I'm very aware of the historical challenges that we face as a nation, but also understand that how we move forward and what great opportunities we have here. So, for the record, a lot of Black people, and I mentioned my stepfather, who was formerly a Black Panther, and he wasn't a big fan of July 4th, right? Independence Day. We call it the day that the Declaration of Independence was signed, was July 4th, 1776. And there's a lot of Black people that are still very critical of that day, among other days. And the reason why there's so much criticism, and rightfully so to a large extent, is that because July 4th, 1776, as this country, as this nation declared its independence from Great Britain, Black people were still legally enslaved in certain places of this country. It was still legal to own slaves in many of the states in this country. And so while the nation was celebrating independence and how important life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was in our founding documents, they had allowed for the enslavement of Black people of African descent here in this country. And so a lot of Black people were not very fond of that, or they didn't celebrate July the 4th. And again, rightfully so. And just a little historical background. We always have to bring these things to the surface because a lot of people will be very critical about the transatlantic slave trade and how white people enslaved Black people. And usually most people have an opinion that's very limited, from a very limited perspective. They're not looking at things from a larger historical perspective. They don't look at it in terms of the history of humankind here on the earth. They just look at it from a very narrow lens of history. And why do I say that, and why is that important? It's important because first and foremost, you have to understand that slavery is one of the oldest institutions in mankind. One of the oldest institutions. It goes back to very early on in the history of recorded history of humanity. right? If you want to go by race, which I don't go by race because race is a social construct, but if you go based on the social construct of race, every race has had slaves. Usually they've enslaved their own, but they've also enslaved others. So if you look in South America, and if you look in the Latino population, there was slaves. If you look at Africa, Asians enslaved other Asians and other people. Europeans enslaved, of course, Africans. But usually, if you want to accurately look at history from the European slave trade, the Europeans learned a lot of what they knew about slavery from the Africans. And some of these quote unquote pro-Black people that are so anti-white and white supremacy because of slavery, they're ignoring the fact that not only did Africans enslave Europeans previously, but Africa still has a thriving slave trade where Africans are buying and selling other Africans right now here in America. And it is reported that there are more people enslaved right now than it was during the time of the transatlantic slave trade. So with that being said, for someone to be so gung-ho about the white supremacy, white colonization, they're ignoring the larger scope of human history and even current history. Because how can I be so mad and down on white people for being so wicked because they enslaved people? Yet if I was a pro-Black person, I would also have to acknowledge the fact that the Black people have enslaved each other and others historically throughout the generations. So anyway, the United States inherited slavery. We didn't create it. And in less than 100 years, they made it legally. They abolished slavery from a legal perspective. And of course, we know Europeans with William Wilberforce. He was the one who fought for many years to abolish slavery in Great Britain. And then many of the abolitionists here in the United States learned from William Wilberforce, who was a white man. The whole story of Amazing Grace is John Newton, who was a pastor, who was a former slave owner, who the message of the gospel saved him and changed and transformed his heart. And he wrote Amazing Grace. And then William Wilberforce was under the tutelage of John Newton. And so it's the message of the gospel that helped to overturn the idea that some human beings were able to be owned and sold by other human beings. But anyway, so we have to look at it from a historical perspective. The foundation of this nation is recorded as July 30th, 1619. That's when the Virginia Company came and landed in Virginia, which was the British colonies first starting here in North America, right? And we know that the British colonies were the forerunner of the formation of what is now known as the United States of America. So if you want to look at the history of the United States as it pertains to slavery, you have to go back to August 25th, 1619. So July 30th, they had the first meeting of the Assembly in Virginia, which was the formation of the government, the foundation of the government that we now have in the United States. And then less than a month later, you had the first slave ships that landed in Port Comfort, Virginia, the White Line, which was recorded as having 20 and odd Negroes, which was believed to be the foundation or the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, at first, they weren't considered slaves or chattel slavery. They were considered indentured servants. Also, the first slave owner in America of the chattel slavery system was a Black man. And so he had enslaved another African descendant. And so if you want to go back and look at it from a realistic standpoint, we need to look at it accurately and look at it from what it really is. And so the United States inherited slavery. We abolished slavery less than 100 years after the nation was formed. So from 1619, we had slavery. 1776, the nation is formally created, the United States, which empowered the federal government, right? The states empowered the federal government, which is where you get the idea of states' rights. And when the government was formed, it was the United States government, the federal government, that received its power from the states. The states created the federal government, not the other way around. And so that's why when the country was first formed, you had certain states that allowed chattel slavery to be legal. Other states didn't. But because of states' rights, they couldn't override the will of the individual states. They had to go through certain processes in order to get it overturned, right? So the Western culture, the Judeo-Western culture through Great Britain and the United States was one of the first cultures and civilizations that legally said that slavery was morally wrong, and they made it illegal to enslave people. So if you want to look at things accurately, you have to commend them for making that stance, because again, there's still people that are enslaved in Africa right now by other Africans. There are people in Asia and around the world that are still being enslaved. And so it's not it's a phenomenon that is almost as old as recorded history. Now, why is that important? That's so important in this conversation about Juneteenth, because the Declaration of Independence that was signed by Abraham Lincoln was supposed to take effect January the 1st, 1863. January the 1st, 1863. And that's where many in the Black church, the tradition of watch night service became popular to many Black congregations because of the fact that they were waiting and counting down till midnight, because you have December 31st, 1862, and then at 12 midnight, which would have been January the 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation would have went into effect and made these slaves free people, right? And so that was one of the areas that you get watch night service from, and they were celebrating their newfound freedom. Now, I'm from the North. I grew up primarily in the North. I was born in Washington, D.C., but I grew up in the North. And so Juneteenth wasn't as big of a celebrated holiday for a couple of particular reasons, right? So I knew about Juneteenth, had heard about it, but we never really celebrated it because it wasn't as relevant in the North as it was in the South. As a matter of fact, Pennsylvania was one of the first states to pass anti-slavery laws. Now, they didn't enforce it, and they also allowed for slave masters in the South. At one point, they allowed slave masters in the South to come up and even recapture slaves that had escaped to the North and take them back to the South. But anyway, Pennsylvania wasn't a big slave state. They abolished slavery, and we didn't have a lot of talk about Juneteenth. But where Juneteenth comes from, of course, we know that the slaves, they had a certain dialect that they spoke. And June the 19th, 1865, is where the actual celebration or observance of Juneteenth comes from. And so January 1st, 1863, slavery is officially abolished by way of the Emancipation Proclamation. But many of the slaves in the Deep South didn't get the memo. Many of the slave owners were probably not very enthusiastic about notifying them. And so from January the 1st, 1863 until many months later, many of the slaves were still operating and functioning as though they were enslaved. But now you have a general who takes his army down through the South, notifying the slaves that they had been freed, and they arrived in Galveston, Texas on June the 19th, 1865. And so once they notified that the slaves had been freed, all the slaves were officially notified and had been set free. And there was a huge celebration, which is where we get the celebration of Juneteenth from. Now, why is this so important to the nation? Our founding documents are some of the greatest legal documents ever created by man. I would say that the only documents that are greater than our Constitution and Bill of Rights is the Bible itself, which is a legal document, whether you recognize it or not. Many people don't understand that. That's the kingdom perspective, and that's a different talk altogether. But I want you to understand that our founding documents, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, are some of the greatest documents ever created, because what happens is, because of the content of those documents, the abolitionists and the civil rights leaders did not have to create anything else. They just had to tap into what was already established constitutionally in the United States. And so we know that the Constitution, or the Bill of Rights, says that all men are created equal and they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And so what the abolitionists had to do was simply to convince and promote the idea that these Black people were men, and women, they were human beings and not chattel property. Now, just a side note, and you've heard me talk about this before, and if you haven't, go through my YouTube channel. I talk about this. The whole idea of race and race science was created. Race is a social construct. It doesn't exist biologically, biblically. There's no such thing as race. And what happens was, it was created as a dynamic in order to help promote the idea that certain people can be enslaved and owned by others. Now, where do you get that from? Because the theory of evolution, which was primarily promoted by Charles Darwin and some of the others, Francis Galton and some of these other people, they promoted, and even before that, they promoted the idea that humanity was created in three main races. So you had Negroid, Mongoloid, and Caucasoid, right? And so because they separated in races, these false social constructs that they created, they also convinced the public at large, using fake news and false science, that people that were Negroes or descendants from Africa and sub-Saharan Africa were less human than the other races, or primarily than the Caucasian race. And they used the physical features of the Africans and their culture to say that they were less evolved. And so because they promoted the idea that they were less evolved, the public as a whole, there wasn't as big of an outcry against slavery, because if you believe that these people were less human, then it's not morally wrong to enslave them, right? Based on that false science and those fake narratives. And but when the abolitionists came along, the only thing they had to do was really rely and depend on the actual documents in our framing works, right? The Bill of Rights and those type of things, right? And for all of those people who are really down and they talk about white supremacy and their, this critical race theory and all this other stuff, they also fail to acknowledge the fact that it was the white abolitionists that were the ones who fought the most vehemently to help to abolish slavery. Especially in Pennsylvania, you had the Quakers who participate in the Underground Railroad. You have the Methodists and these other Christians, what we call evangelical Christians. They took a position that slavery was morally wrong based on biblical principles. And so they fought hard to abolish slavery and even risked their own lives and their own family and fortune in order to fight to abolish slavery. People also failed to acknowledge the fact that in the Civil War, that it was white people primarily, it was a majority of white people fighting North versus South, and that hundreds of thousands of white people died to fight against the cause of slavery. So if we want to look at history, we have to look at it from an accurate historical perspective in order for us to have a real open and honest dialogue, right? But when you look at it from that perspective, it puts things in different contexts, right? And so again, because July 4th, 1776 is looked at by many Black people who know things from a historical perspective as a very hypocritical date, again, because the nation who had fought for their freedom, right, in the Revolutionary War, declared their own freedom and independence, still allowed within the borders of this nation for other men to be enslaved. So that's where the hypocrisy comes in. But because of the framing documents and because of those who stood on the principles that were represented in the Constitution, we made amends, right? We made it right. We legally not only abolished slavery, but this army from the North made it a point to go and execute this, the idea that all these men were free. And they marched throughout the South to notify these people that they were no longer enslaved, but they were free. And so just as much as we have to acknowledge the black eye on America and some of its terrible past, we also have to acknowledge that they were the forefront in fighting for liberties and freedom here in America. Now, again, we still have had issues and still have issues from time to time. But when you compare it with every other nation on the earth, every other nation on the earth has its own set of issues. You always have separation of certain people groups from other people groups. And you always have an oppressed group and a group that are considered the oppressors, whether it's Europe, Asia, Africa, South America, anywhere in the world, because that's part of the fallen nature of humanity. And so, again, I would just challenge you to really look at this thing from a historical perspective. Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights leaders of the day in the 60s, they were able to be successful because of the great things that were written in our founding documents, right? Again, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Martin Luther King stated in his I Have a Dream speech that our founding fathers had written a promissory note in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and that Black America, when they marched on Washington, weren't there to do anything new, but simply to cash the check that promissory note made provision for. So they only had to tap into what was already established in our Constitution in order for us to become free and to make amends for the terrible things of the past. And so again, I would just encourage you all to learn about Juneteenth. if you do love America and love the principles that it stands for, then I think Juneteenth is a great example of when you stand for principles, even when you make mistakes, you can reconcile things and make things right as long as you focus on the principles that were written in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. And so, again, I think it's a great celebration. I think it's okay to celebrate July 4th because I still believe this is the greatest nation on the earth. But also, I think that all of us should, in America, who love this country, should also take time to really acknowledge and to learn more about Juneteenth, which is America's attempt at righting the wrongs of slavery and segregation and all those other terrible things that happened in our past. Until next time, peace and blessings to you. Shalom, shalom.